Hello, and welcome to this time of Bible study. I'm your leader, Wayne Williams, and it's truly my privilege to share this time with you. Thank you for sharing your time with me. We've been looking at a series of lessons during this month of September from the book of Esther. As I've said before, it's not one of those books that we study very often, and yet it has a powerful story to it and a powerful message to us about how God interacts with the world and with his people and how he brings his will to play in them in marvelous ways. If we have eyes to see and ears to hear, and we can open our hearts to him in that special way. Remember the story of Esther. Esther was a Jew. She had been adopted by her uncle Mordecai. Senior moment there, pardon. Uh, she was adopted by her uncle Mordecai, and they were in Persia. This is probably after the time that Ezra and Nehemiah took a large portion of the Jews that were in Babylon and after Babylon, Persia, uh, back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. But Mordecai and Esther and other Jews had chosen to stay there in Persia for one reason or another. They had been there for a long time. That was the lifestyle they knew. That was the people they knew. They had connections. All kinds of reasons that we can rationalize about why they would have chosen to stay. But they chose to stay in Persia, and they were just a remnant of the Jewish people there in that large Persian kingdom. Uh, Esther, if you'll remember, won a beauty contest and became the queen as the king was looking for a new queen. And yet she held back and didn't say anything about her Jewish heritage uh, because she wasn't sure how that would be accepted. And also her uncle Mordecai, who was himself placed in a government kind of role, sitting at the king's gate, probably taking taxes, doing any sorts of number of other kind of administrative things. But he was an official of the government too, and he told her, just don't say anything about that you're a Jew, and we'll see how that plays out. And Esther and the king have a very good relationship. He seems to be very satisfied with her as his queen. He They have a good relationship, and yet the king and his right hand man Haman uh, talked together about an incident where Haman felt like he had been disrespected by the Jews, and he wanted to just wipe the Jews out. He wanted to send out an edict that said, kill all the Jews. And he did do that. The king gave him the authority to do that. He sent out this message, and he said, on such and such a day, uh, in all the 127 provinces of Persia, uh, on that day, the people are ordered to rise up against the Jews and to kill them, men, women, and children, and to take possession of their goods and to move on as though they never had existed. Just a complete annihilation of a whole race of people within that kingdom. And the king had gone along with that. But later we find Mordecai is saying to Esther, Esther, you're in a prime position to be able to get the king's ear and make sure he really understands the ramifications of this edict that he's allowed Haman to do. And Haman, Esther prays about it. She asks the people to pray about it. She goes before the king, and that in itself was a very dangerous kind of thing. That's one of the things we've seen in this story is all kinds of different emotions: fear, danger, courage, faith, hope, all kinds of feelings that come out of this being attacked and being confronted and being mistreated as people in living in within a people other than their own. Jews not living within the Jewish kingdom. Well, we've gone through that story, and we've seen so many different beautiful ways that God interacts through Esther, interacts through Mordecai. We find that Haman, the villain, is finally put in his place. That Queen Esther is able to convince the king that Haman's edict is unjust and corrupt, and the king kills has Haman killed and property turned over to Esther and to Mordecai, and it sounds almost like a fairy tale ending. And yet that edict is still out there. And once a king's edict is issued, once it is sealed with that king's signet ring, it's a law. And now there's no way to undo that. You can post another law that makes a response to that, but you can't undo the one that was sent. And so here we are in a very precarious situation. We've got all these Jews who are under threat of being attacked and killed, and Esther and Mordecai in a position where they might be able to do something to help, but what? And so that's where our story takes up today in Esther, the 8th chapter. I encourage you to read chapters 8, 9, and 10 because it kind of brings the story to an end and helps us to see all this. But we'll just look at the passage for our Sunday school lesson this morning. Esther chapter 8. That same day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther what Haman, the enemy of the Jews, owned. Mordecai himself, that's Esther's uncle, came before the king because Esther had told the king that he was family to her. The king took off his royal ring, the one he had removed from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. Esther put Mordecai in charge of what Haman had owned. Perhaps this is because a woman, really even the queen, didn't own property outright in her own right in this nature, this time and this culture. So she passes that on to her uncle Mordecai, and he is now in charge of all the things that Haman had before. Esther again spoke before the king. She bowed at his feet, wept, and begged him to treat her kindly. She wanted him to overturn the evil plot of Haman, the Agagite, his secret plan directed against the Jews. The king held out the gold scepter to Esther, and she got up and stood before him, and she said, "If the king wishes, and if I please him, that is, if the idea seems right to the king, and if he still sees me as a good person, then have people write something to call back the order that put into effect the plan of Haman. That he wrote to destroy the Jews in all the royal provinces. How can I bear to watch the terrible evil about to sweep over my people? And how can I bear to watch others destroy my own family?" King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, I've given Esther everything Haman owned, and Haman himself my servants have impaled on a pole because he planned to attack the Jews. So you yourselves write to the Jews whatever you like in the name of the king, and seal the letters with the king's royal ring. Anything written in the name of the king and sealed in the king's royal ring won't be called back." Now that is a two-edged sword because that means the first edict was not able to be called back, but now there's a second edict that's going out. So that was when the royal scribes were summoned, and the 23rd day of the third month, they wrote exactly what Mordecai ordered to the Jews, rulers, governors, and officials of the provinces from India to Cush, 127 in all. They wrote in the alphabet of each province and in the language of each people. They wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed the order with the king's royal ring. He sent letters with riders mounted on royal horses bred from mares known to run fast. In other words, it was great haste as they got this edict out into the hands of the people in the provinces. The order allowed the Jews in each town to join together and defend themselves. The Jews were free to wipe out, kill, and destroy every army of any people and province that attacked them, along with their women and children. They could also take up and keep anything the attackers owned. The day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on which they could do so was the 13th day of the 12th month. That is the same date that Haman had put in his original edict. A copy of the writing was to become law in each province and be on public display for all its peoples to read. The Jews were to be ready on this day to get back at their enemies. The riders mounted on royal horses left Susa, that's the capital city, spurred on by the king's order, and the law also became public in the fortified parts of Susa. Mordecai went out from the king's presence in a blue and white royal robe, wearing a large golden crown and a white and red purple coat. The city of Susa greeted him with shouts of joy. For the Jews, it was a day of light, happiness, joy, and honor. Think about all these feelings coming in after all this fear and anguish and uncertainty and feeling unable to handle the situation. Now there's joy. For the Jews, it was a day of light, happiness, joy, and honor. In every province and in every town, wherever the king's order and his law arrived, for the Jews, it was a day of happiness and joy. For them, it was for them, it meant feasts and a holiday. Many people in the land became Jews themselves out of fear of the Jews. What a turnaround. What a wonderful story. As we see how God works through Esther and Mordecai, through his people, how he even touches the heart of this Persian king who doesn't know God in the same sense as the Jews knew God and didn't respect God in that way, but nonetheless respected these people and who they were and what they had done, and how it all comes together. The Jews now were given permission to defend themselves. Now, why did they need permission to defend themselves? Well, they were vassals in another state, another country, and for them to raise up an armed defense could have been interpreted as defiance and insurgents. And so this second edict gives them the opportunity to prepare, to man up, to get their weapons ready, to be ready to fight the onslaught that would come. And it did come. If you read on into chapter 10, there were some who responded to that initial edict, and the Jews in turn defended themselves. One of the things you need to notice in this edict that Mordecai sent out to the people is it doesn't give the Jews the right to attack other people. What it does is it gives the Jews the right to defend themselves. It also gives the Jews the right to take the spoils of those that they defeat in such a battle. But we're told in chapter 10 that the Jews didn't do that. It was simply preserving their nation, their nationality, their people, and bringing peace in the land where they were. They weren't trying to become a dominant force. They were simply wanting to be able to live in peace and harmony and to do the things that God had called them to do, to have the riches and the sense of God's presence in their lives without a fear of being retaliated against in some way or another. The Jews faced so much, and this is one area where we really owe a debt of gratitude to the Jews, because they were the initial evangelists. God chose these people out from among all the peoples of the world, and he gave them a special place in his heart. And while they were human beings and they often failed to meet up to God's standards, and he had to correct them and had to readjust the things and that sort of thing, they nonetheless stayed true to their worship of God, and they kept coming back to God. And they kept renewing that faith in him. And because of that, they were such a dynamic witness to Yahweh in the world of that day. They didn't give up on their God, and their God didn't give up on them. There's a psalm that is attached to today's lesson. Each week we've had a psalm that was attached, and the psalms often kind of reinforce the bit of the story that we've seen that week. And Psalm 30 is a good example of that. I want to just read through it real quickly. Here the psalmist says, "I exalt you, Lord, because you pulled me up. You didn't let my enemies celebrate over me. Lord, my God, I cried out to you for help, and you healed me. Lord, you brought me up from the grave, brought me back to life from among those going down to the pit. Weeping may stay all night, but by morning, joy. You changed my mourning into dancing. You took off my funeral clothes and dressed me up in joy, so that my whole being might sing praises to you and never stop. Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever." Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Acknowledging how God has taken a situation and turned it to the good of his people and faithful people who trusted him, and he has been faithful to his promises to see that through. What a powerful story the story of Esther is. A little book that's tucked away in our Old Testament and we might not pay a whole lot of attention to, and yet it really has a lot to say to us, doesn't it? I want to encourage you here at the end of this study to go back and read through the book of Esther. It's not a very long book. It won't take you too long to read through it, but read through it now with all the things that we've talked about these 5 weeks in these Bible study times, and let the words really resonate in your heart and in your mind so that you can see how it all fits together. And what you will see is a beautiful thread of God fulfilling his promise, empowering his people, going with them, undergirding them, giving them strength and authority, even in a far and distant land where they were very much subject to the powers that be, not to their own will. But the Jews were being faithful. They everywhere they went. Daniel in Babylon, he had the same problem that the Jews are having here in Persia. In that, what made Haman mad at Mordecai to start with was that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, and Daniel refused to bow down to the golden statue of the king of Babylon. The Jews remained faithful to their God and they worshiped their God. The Lord our God is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall worship the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. What a powerful statement of faith. And we find the Jewish people, where they go, and in the situations that they get into, being faithful to their side of that promise. Maybe not completely faithful in the same sense that God is faithful, because they're humans and they get off track. But nonetheless, coming back to that and staying that connection with God in between them and God. Well, it's been a good 5 weeks. Esther is a powerful story, and I hope it has touched your heart and your life in a special way. I hope you've seen fear. I hope you've seen how to deal with fear. Esther called the people together to pray, and they prayed fervently. And then, even though she was still afraid, she went before the king and made her request. She had courage. She was encouraged. She was filled by God's power to be able to go ahead and to put her needs aside and to follow God's will for his people and to speak up for them. For she alone was in that position. Remember that famous passage that we have from Mordecai saying, "Who knows, Esther, this may be the very reason why you are who you are." It's a wonderful aha moment in all of our lives, isn't it? When we find those ways that we are who we are because God has chosen us for a specific task or place to be, a thing to do. God is good. I hope you have a great week. Remember Esther? Think about her and her faith. And Mordecai, think about him and his. Think about all the things that they face that you and I face too, just not in exactly the same way. But fear and misunderstanding by other people, people misinterpreting our actions sometimes, and our intent being pure to worship God. I hope you have a week that you can be as the Jews were to the people in Persia, an example of God's people. God bless you. Have a great week.